The chapel in the Hamptons glowed like a jewel against the twilight, its stained glass windows casting fractured rainbows across the pews. The scent of roses and melting candle wax hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that should have felt romantic, but instead made my stomach churn. I stood at the altar, my white wedding gown shimmering under the chandelier lights, the silk cool against my skin as I adjusted the bodice for the 10th time. The fabric felt like a lie, just like this moment, beautiful on the outside, hollow within. I, Elizabeth Harper, 26 years old, was a bride in a ceremony I never wanted, a pawn in a game I couldn't escape. The murmurs of the guests, old money aristocrats in their tailored suits and glittering gowns, echoed softly, their eyes boring into me with a mix of pity and amusement. I could feel their judgment, their whispered gossip about the Harper heiress who thought she could rise above her place. My hands trembled as I clutched the bouquet of white roses, the stems wrapped so tightly in ribbon that I couldn't feel the thorns, though I wished I could. I needed something, anything, to ground me, to remind me I was still here, still me, despite the humiliation threatening to swallow me whole. My brother James stood a few feet away, his smirk as sharp as the edge of a blade. At 35, he carried the weight of the Harper legacy on his shoulders, but he wore it like a crown, not a burden. He'd always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I was the spare, too ambitious, too headstrong, too much. And now he'd found the perfect way to remind me of my place. "This will teach you humility, Elizabeth," he'd sneered just minutes ago, his voice dripping with malice as we stood in the antechamber. "You've always thought you're better than us." His words echoed in my mind, each syllable a lash against my pride. I wanted to scream, to throw the bouquet at his feet and storm out of this gilded cage, but I couldn't. James held the reins to Harper Enterprises, the family empire I'd poured my youth into building, the one thing that gave my life meaning. If I defied him, I'd lose everything, my career, my legacy, my future. So here I was, dressed in white, about to marry a homeless man as a cruel jest, all because James wanted to see me break. "You don't get to decide my life, James," I'd hissed back, my voice trembling with rage and fear. But his laughter had been my only answer, a sound that still rang in my ears as I stood at the altar. I'd never known love, never let anyone close enough to try. I was still a virgin, not out of some romantic notion of purity, but because I'd never had the chance to be anything else. My family had controlled every step of my life since I was a child, my mother Margaret too broken after my father's death to fight for me, and James too eager to keep me in line. I'd buried myself in work, in proving my worth, in building a fortress around my heart so thick that no one could breach it. But tonight, James had found a way to tear it down. He wanted to humiliate me, to force me into this farce of a marriage with a man who had nothing, just to remind me that I too could be nothing. The chapel doors creaked open, and the murmurs of the guests fell silent. My heart pounded against my ribcage, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out the soft crash of waves beyond the walls. I braced myself for the sight of a ragged figure, a man in tattered clothes with unkempt hair, and the stench of the streets clinging to him. I'd prepared myself to look at him with disdain, to hold my head high, even as my dignity crumbled. But the man who stepped through the doors was nothing like I'd imagined. Damian Blackwood walked with the confidence of a king, his black suit tailored to perfection, hugging a frame that spoke of strength and discipline. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his jawline was sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were amber, fierce and unyielding, like a wolf sizing up its prey. He moved with a predator's grace, each step echoing on the stone floor, and when he reached the altar, he stood before me, towering and unapologetic. The air between us crackled, a charged silence that sent a jolt down my spine. as if I'd touched a live wire. My breath caught, and for a moment, I forgot how to exhale. Who was this man? He didn't look like a homeless drifter, didn't carry the weight of despair I'd expected. Instead, he radiated power, a quiet intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My heart raced, not from fear, but from something else. Something I couldn't name. The guests whispered again, their voices a low hum of confusion, and I saw James's smirk falter for the first time. But Damien's gaze never left mine, those amber eyes boring into me as if he could see straight through to the broken pieces I kept hidden. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but my throat felt tight, my words trapped behind a wall of shock and uncertainty. The chandelier lights above us flickered, casting shadows that danced across his face, and for a fleeting moment, I thought, I saw something in his expression, something raw, something real. But before I could decipher it, the priest cleared his throat, and the ceremony began, pulling me into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The chapel felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the priest's voice droned on, his words a dull hum against the pounding of my heart. The candlelight flickered, casting golden shadows across the stained glass windows, their colors bleeding into the air like a broken promise. I stood at the altar, my white gown a mockery of the purity it was meant to symbolize, the silk heavy against my skin. The scent of roses and melted wax was suffocating, mingling with the faint saltiness of the ocean breeze that slipped through the cracks of the old Hamptons chapel. I clutched my bouquet of roses tighter, the stems digging into my palms through the satin ribbon, a sharp reminder that I was still here, still trapped in this farce. Damien Blackwood stood beside me, his presence a storm I couldn't ignore. His black suit was a stark contrast to the soft glow of the candles, and his amber eyes, those piercing, unyielding eyes, were fixed on the priest, not on me. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, not after the way he'd walked in, not after the jolt of electricity I'd felt when our gazes first met. He didn't belong here, not in this cruel jest my brother James had orchestrated. James wanted me to marry a homeless man, to humiliate me into submission, to ensure I'd never challenge his claim to Harper Enterprises. But Damien wasn't the ragged figure I'd expected. He was something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something I couldn't understand. The priest's voice rose, pulling me back to the moment. Do you, Elizabeth Harper, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The words hit me like a slap, and I felt the eyes of the guests, those vultures in their glittering gowns and tailored suits, boring into me, waiting for my collapse. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear this gown to shreds and flee into the night. But James's smirk from the front pew held me in place, a silent reminder of what I'd lose if I defied. Him. My career, my legacy, my entire world. It all hung in the balance. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, Damien's voice cut through the silence, low and steady, meant only for me. You don't have to do this. The words were a whisper, a secret shared in the shadow of the altar, and they sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to him, my breath catching as our eyes finally met. Those amber eyes weren't cold anymore. They were searching, as if he could see the storm raging inside me. For a moment, I forgot the priest, the guests, the weight of James's expectations. There was only Damien, and the quiet strength in his voice that made me question everything. Who are you to tell me what to do? I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended, but it trembled at the edges, betraying the fear I couldn't hide. My hands tightened around the bouquet, the thorns pricking through the ribbon now, a faint sting that grounded me. Damien's gaze didn't waver, but something flickered in his expression, something I couldn't name. You'll find out soon enough, Elizabeth, he said, his voice a low rumble that sent another shiver through me. There was no mockery in his tone, no pity, just a certainty that made my stomach twist with unease. The priest cleared his throat, a subtle reprimand, and I forced myself to turn back to him. "I do," I said, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. They were a lie, a betrayal of everything I'd ever wanted for myself, but I had no choice. The priest nodded, oblivious to the war inside me, and continued the ceremony. Damien's turn came, and he spoke his vow without hesitation, his voice steady and unyielding. "I do." The words were a chain, binding me to a man I didn't know, a man who shouldn't have been here, a man who was unraveling everything I thought. I understood. The ceremony ended with a hollow exchange of rings, simple gold bands that felt like shackles on my finger. The guests clapped politely, their applause a mockery of the moment, and I forced a smile, my face a mask of composure while my heart screamed. James's smirk widened, a silent victory, and I wanted nothing more than to wipe it off his face. But before I could move, Damien took my hand, his grip firm but not harsh, and led me away from the altar, down the aisle, and through a side door into a small room at the back of the chapel. The room was dim, lit only by a few flickering candles on a wooden table. The air smelled of old wood and wax, a scent that was both comforting and oppressive. Damien released my hand and stepped back, giving me space, but his presence still filled the room, a quiet intensity that made it hard to breathe. I set the bouquet down on the table, my fingers lingering on the petals, their softness a stark contrast to the hardness I felt inside. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, until I couldn't stand it anymore. "Why are you here?" I demanded, turning to face him, my voice sharp but unsteady. "What do you get out of this?" My hands clenched into fists at my sides, the gold ring on my finger a foreign weight I wanted to tear off. Damien didn't flinch at my tone. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, and watched me with those amber eyes that seemed to see too much. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, his voice calm, but laced with something deeper, something that made my heart skip a beat. He straightened, taking a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back, my back brushing against the table. The candlelight danced across his face, illuminating the sharp lines of his jaw, the faint scar above his eyebrow I hadn't noticed before. "But I'm here for a reason, Elizabeth," he continued, his gaze never leaving mine. "And by the end of this night, you'll understand why." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the weight of his words, the certainty in his voice stopped me cold. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than anger or fear, a flicker of curiosity, a whisper of something I couldn't name. And as I stood there, in the shadow of the chapel lights, I realized that this man, this stranger I'd just married, might be the key to unraveling the prison my life had become. The small room behind the chapel felt like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and melted wax, the flickering candles on the table casting a warm glow that danced across the walls. Through the tiny window, I could hear the distant crash of waves against the Hamptons shore, a steady rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead felt like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name. I stood near the table, my fingers brushing the soft petals of the bouquet I'd set down, their delicate texture a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. The gold ring on my finger felt heavier than ever, a cold reminder of the vow I'd just spoken, a vow I didn't mean. Damien Blackwood stood a few feet away, his presence as commanding as it had been at the altar. The candlelight illuminated the sharp lines of his face, highlighting the faint scar above his eyebrow and the intensity in his amber eyes. Those eyes hadn't left me since we'd entered the room, and I felt their weight like a physical touch, stripping away the walls I'd spent years building around myself. I wanted to look away, to hide the vulnerability I knew he could see, but I couldn't. There was something about him, something raw, something real, that held me captive. "Why should I believe anything you say?" I snapped, my voice sharp, but trembling at the edges. I crossed my arms, trying to reclaim some semblance of control, but my hands shook as I did. "You're part of this sick game my brother cooked up. You're no better than he is." The words were meant to wound, to push him away, but they felt hollow even as I spoke them. Deep down, I knew Damien wasn't what James had expected him to be. He wasn't a homeless drifter, a pawn in a cruel jest. He was something else entirely, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. Damien didn't flinch at my accusation. He leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. "You think you're the only victim here?" he said, his voice low and steady, each word carrying a weight that made my breath catch. "I lost everything before I gained it all, Elizabeth." There was a rawness in his tone, a quiet pain that cut through my defenses like a knife. I wanted to scoff, to dismiss his words as a lie, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was the look of a man who'd seen more darkness than I could imagine, a man who'd survived it and come out the other side. He pushed off the wall and took a step closer, the candlelight casting shadows across his face. I instinctively stepped back, my hip brushing against the table, the bouquet tipping slightly. "My mother was a single woman, cast out by people like your family," he continued, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. Anger, maybe, or grief. "She worked herself to death to give me a chance, and I watched her die because the world wouldn't give her one. So yes, I've lived as a homeless man, Elizabeth. I've walked in those shoes to remind myself what really matters, to see who people truly are when they think no one's watching." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over the walls I'd built around my heart. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that my family wasn't like that. But the memories came unbidden. James's sneers, my father's cold indifference, the way my mother Margaret had withered under their expectations after my father's death. I'd been judged my whole life, deemed not good enough, not perfect enough, not worthy of the Harper name. I'd fought so hard to prove them wrong, to build a career that would make them see me, but all it had gotten me was this moment, this humiliating farce of a wedding, orchestrated to break me. "You think I'll believe that story?" I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and something else. Something softer, something I didn't want to name. "You're just trying to get out of this. You don't care about me." But even as I spoke, I felt the lie in my words. There was a truth in Damien's eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored my own, and it terrified me. I didn't want to feel this connection, didn't want to see myself in his pain. I'd spent so long keeping everyone at arm's length, protecting myself from the hurt that came with letting someone in. But Damien was slipping through my defenses, and I didn't know how to stop him. "I don't need your pity," I added, my voice breaking as I turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. I sat down on the wooden chair beside the table, my hands fumbling for the handkerchief in my sleeve. I wiped my fingers, trying to erase the phantom sting of the bouquet's thorns, but the motion felt futile. The real pain wasn't in my hands. It was in my heart, a deep ache I'd ignored for too long. Damien didn't move closer, but his voice softened, a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. "I'm not here to pity you, Elizabeth," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring, its surface worn but polished, as if it had been cherished for years. He held it out to me, his hand steady. This was my mother's. She gave it to me before she died, told me to find someone who'd see me for who I really am, not what the world thinks I should be. I stared at the ring, my breath catching in my throat. It was simple, nothing like the ostentatious jewels My family valued, but there was a beauty in its simplicity, a history etched into its surface. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I took it from him. It was warm from his touch, a warmth that seemed to seep into my skin, chasing away the cold that had settled in my bones. "You can leave," Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper, "now. But I want you to know I'm not your enemy." I looked up at him, and for the first time, I saw beyond the sharp edges of his face, beyond the intensity of his gaze. I saw a man who'd been broken and rebuilt, a man who understood, lost in a way I never had. And in that moment, I felt a connection, a fragile, tentative thread that tied us together, despite everything. I clutched the ring in my hand, its warmth a lifeline in the darkness, and I realized that this night, this man, might change everything I thought I knew about myself. The rain came down in sheets as I stumbled out of the chapel, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind me with a hollow thud. The cold droplets stung my skin, soaking through the delicate silk of my wedding gown, the fabric clinging to my body like a second skin. My heels sank into the wet gravel of the path leading to the beach, and I kicked them off, the sharp pebbles biting into my bare feet as I ran. I didn't care. I needed to get away. Away from the chapel, away from the guests, away from the weight of the gold ring on my finger and the man who'd placed it there. The ocean roared in the distance, its voice a wild, untamed thing that matched the chaos in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay in that room with Damien Blackwood a moment longer. His words, his story, the silver ring still clutched in my hand. They were too much, too real. I'd spent my life building walls around my heart, keeping everyone at a distance to protect myself from the pain of being seen, of being hurt. But Damien had slipped through those walls with his quiet intensity, his amber eyes that seemed to see every broken piece of me. And that terrified me more than James's cruel jest ever could. "Elizabeth," Damien's voice cut through the rain, sharp and urgent, and I heard the crunch of gravel as he chased after me. I didn't stop, didn't turn around, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I reached the edge of the beach. The sand was cold and wet beneath my feet, the waves crashing against the shore with a ferocity that mirrored the storm inside me. The chapel's lights glowed faintly in the distance, a beacon I wanted to erase, a reminder of the nightmare I'd just lived through. "Elizabeth, wait!" Damien called again, closer now, and I felt his hand on my arm, pulling me to a stop. I whirled around, yanking my arm free, my wet hair plastered to my face, my gown heavy with rain. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice raw, the words swallowed by the wind. The rain blurred my vision, but I could still see his face, those amber eyes burning through the storm, his dark hair dripping with water. He looked as undone as I felt, his suit soaked through, but there was a fire in his gaze that made my heart stutter. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice breaking as the rain mingled with the tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" My hands clenched into fists, the silver ring digging into my palm, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold that seeped into my bones. I wanted answers, needed them, but I was afraid of what they might mean, afraid of the way Damien made me feel, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between falling and flying. Damien stepped closer, undeterred by my outburst, his expression a mix of determination and something softer, something I didn't want to name. "I know about your brother's game," he said, his voice steady despite the rain, each word cutting through the roar of the ocean. "I knew what James was planning, and I let him think he'd won. But I'm here to teach him a lesson, Elizabeth. To teach you both what it means to judge someone by what you think you see." His words hit me like a punch, and I staggered back, my bare feet slipping on the wet sand. "You knew?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. You knew what he was doing, and you still went along with it? The betrayal stung, sharper than the rain, and I felt a fresh wave of anger surge through me. I'd thought for a fleeting moment that Damien might be different, that he might be someone I could trust. But he was just another player in James's twisted game, using me to make a point. I had to, Damien said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. He took another step closer, and this time I didn't back away, too stunned to move. I've spent years building an empire, Elizabeth, but I lost myself in the process. I turned my back on love, on family, because I thought power was the only thing that mattered. I was wrong. And when I heard about James's plan, I saw a chance to make things right, to show you that there's more to life than the world your family has trapped you in. I stared at him, my chest heaving, the rain streaming down my face as his words sank in. I wanted to hate him, to push him away, to cling to the anger that had kept me safe for so long. But there was a sincerity in his voice, a raw honesty in his eyes, that made it impossible. I thought of my mother, Margaret, the way she'd taught me to hold on to hope even when the world tried to break me. She'd been a single mother after my father's death, a woman who'd fought for me even when she had nothing left to give. And here was Damien, a man who'd lost his own mother to a world that judged her too harshly, standing in the rain and offering me a truth I wasn't ready to face. I shivered, the cold seeping deeper into my bones, and Damien noticed. Without a word, he shrugged off his soaked suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment as he adjusted it. The jacket was heavy, but it carried his warmth, a heat that chased away the chill and made my breath catch. I looked up at him, our faces inches apart, the rain blurring the edges of the world until it was just the two of us. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, Damien pulled me into his arms. His embrace was firm, unyielding, but there was a tenderness in it that broke something inside me. The rain continued to fall, the waves crashing against the shore. But for the first time that night, I didn't feel alone. I didn't push him away. I let myself lean into him, let his warmth seep into me, let the storm rage around us. While I found a moment of peace in the chaos, in that embrace, I felt the first stirrings of something new, something that might just change everything. The rain had slowed to a drizzle as Damien and I stepped back into the chapel, the heavy door creaking shut behind us. Water dripped from my soaked gown, pooling on the stone floor, and I shivered despite the warmth of Damien's jacket still draped over my shoulders. The air inside was thick with the scent of roses and candle wax, but the atmosphere had shifted since we'd left. The guests, those glittering vultures in their designer gowns and tailored suits, had returned to their seats, their murmurs rising like a swarm of bees as they watched us re-enter. Their eyes were sharp, hungry for drama, and I felt the weight of their judgment settle over me like a shroud. Damien's hand rested lightly on the small of my back, a steadying presence that kept me from bolting again. My bare feet were cold against the stone, the hem of my gown dragging with every step. But I held my head high, refusing to let them see me break. I could still feel the warmth of his embrace on the beach, the way his arms had anchored me in the storm, and it gave me a strange kind of courage, a courage I hadn't known I possessed. But that courage faltered when I saw James standing near the altar, his smirk as sharp as ever, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Well, well," James drawled, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "The blushing bride returns. I hope you enjoyed your little moment with your husband." The word dripped with mockery, and a few of the guests tittered, their laughter a cruel echo in the sacred space. My hands clenched into fists, the silver ring Damien had given me still in my palm, its warmth a reminder of the man beside me. I wanted to scream at James, to wipe that smirk off his face, but before I could, Damien stepped forward, his presence commanding the room in a way that made even James falter. "I won't let anyone hurt her again," Damien said, his voice low and steady, but it carried a weight that silenced the crowd. He turned to face James, his amber eyes blazing with a fire I hadn't seen before. "You thought you could use me to break her, didn't you? You thought I was just a pawn in your game. A homeless man you could parade around to humiliate your sister and secure your precious empire." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, and I saw James's smirk waver, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "But I'm not who you think I am," Damien continued, his voice rising now, each word a hammer striking stone. "My name is Damien Blackwood, and I'm the CEO of Blackwood Industries. I've spent years building an empire of my own, and tonight, I made a decision that changes everything." He turned to me, his gaze softening for a moment, and then back to James, his expression hardening again. "I just bought Harper Enterprises. It's mine now, James. And I did it to protect Elizabeth from you." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps and whispers filled the air. A glass shattered as one of the guests dropped their champagne flute in. Shock, and James's face went white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Harper Enterprises, the company I'd poured my life into, the legacy I'd fought for, was no longer in James's hands. Damien had taken it, not for himself, but for me. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't name: relief, gratitude, and something deeper, something that made my chest ache. You can't do that," James finally sputtered, his voice trembling, with rage as he stumbled forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you can buy everything, don't you? You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine?" His voice cracked, and I saw the desperation in his eyes, the fear of a man who'd just lost everything he'd fought to control. The guests were on their feet now, their whispers turning into a roar, and I caught snippets of their words. Blackwood Industries, Harper Enterprises, a fraud. As the scandal began to take shape, the weight of the moment crashed over me, and I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't expected: satisfaction. For years, James had held power over me, using his control of the company to keep me in line, to make me feel small. And now, in a single night, Damien had turned the tables. But the satisfaction was quickly overshadowed by a new fear. The media would be all over this. Headlines like, "Harper heiress marries a fraud," or "Blackwood billionaire buys Harper empire," would be plastered across every tabloid by morning. The public scrutiny, the judgment, the whispers, it would all come crashing down on my family, on me. I turned to Damien, my voice barely a whisper. "Why?" I asked, my eyes searching his. "Why would you do this?" He looked at me, and for a moment, the chaos of the room faded away. "Because you deserve better," he said simply, his voice soft but firm. "Because I've seen what people like James do to those they're supposed to protect, and because I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy you." Before I could respond, I caught sight of my mother, Margaret, standing near the back of the chapel. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with worry, and I felt a pang of guilt for what this night had done to her. I broke away from Damien and ran to her, my wet gown trailing behind me, and threw my arms around her. "I'm sorry, Mom," I whispered, my voice breaking as I buried my face in her shoulder. Her familiar scent, lavender and warmth, enveloped me, and I felt her arms tighten around me, a silent promise that she was still here, still mine. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a cacophony of shock and speculation, and I knew the battle had just begun. James was still glaring at Damien, his face a mask of fury, but I didn't care. I turned back to Damien, my hand finding his, and I squeezed it tightly. "You were wrong, James," I said, my voice steady now, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And you'll pay for it." The chapel lights flickered above us, casting long shadows across the room, and I felt a fire ignite inside me, a fire that would carry me through whatever came next. The scandal broke like a tidal wave, sweeping through the media with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. "Harper heiress marries a fraud," screamed one tabloid, while another declared, "Blackwood billionaire buys Harper empire in shocking power play." The paparazzi swarmed outside my family's Manhattan penthouse, their cameras flashing like vultures circling a carcass. And I felt the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on me, heavier than the rain-soaked gown I'd worn the night before. I sat in the back of Damien's sleek black car, the tinted windows shielding us from the chaos outside. But the glow of streetlights filtering through the glass cast eerie shadows across his face. Damien's jaw was set, his amber eyes fixed on the road ahead as he drove, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. He hadn't spoken much since we'd left the chapel, since he'd turned my world upside down by buying Harper Enterprises to protect me from James. I wanted to thank him, to tell him how much it meant, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I clutched the silver ring he'd given me, its warmth a small comfort against the storm brewing inside me. The media frenzy was just the beginning. I knew James wouldn't let this go without a fight, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. My phone buzzed incessantly in my lap, notifications piling up from news alerts and messages. I glanced at the screen, my stomach twisting as I saw a text from Sophie, my best friend since college. "Liz, call me. I found something about James you need to know." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, but before I could respond, Damien's voice broke the silence. "You don't have to face this alone," he said, his tone soft but firm, his eyes still on the road. "Whatever happens, I'm here." I looked at him, my chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and fear. "You don't even know me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Why are you doing this?" He glanced at me then, his gaze softening, and for a moment, I saw the man who'd held me in the rain, the man who'd given me his mother's ring. "Because I see you, Elizabeth," he said simply, "and I know what it's like to be trapped by a world that doesn't care." His words lingered in the air as we pulled up to my family's estate in the Hamptons, the same place where this nightmare had begun. The house was quiet, the lights dim, but I knew my mother Margaret was inside, waiting for me. She'd been unwell since the scandal broke, the stress taking a toll on her already fragile health, and I felt a pang of guilt for what my actions had done to her. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin, and Damien followed, his presence a steady anchor as we walked inside. The living room was warm, the fireplace crackling softly, but my mother's face was pale as she sat on the couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice trembling, as she reached for me. I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine, their frailness a stark reminder of how much she'd sacrificed for me over the years. "I'm so sorry, Mom," I said, my voice breaking as I pressed her hands to my cheek. "I never meant for any of this to happen." She shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not your fault, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's James. He's let his pain turn him into someone I don't recognize." Her words hit me hard, and I felt a fresh wave of guilt for the rift between my brother and me. I wanted to fix it, to heal our family, but I didn't know how. Not when James was still out there, plotting to take back what Damien had claimed. I stood and walked to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. I filled the kettle with water, my hands trembling as I set it on the stove, the familiar ritual of making tea for my mother grounding me in the chaos. The steam rose in soft curls, and I inhaled the faint scent of chamomile, letting it calm my racing thoughts. But my phone buzzed again, and this time, I couldn't ignore it. I called Sophie, my heart pounding as I waited for her to answer. "Liz, thank God," Sophie said, her voice urgent. "I dug into James's past, something I should have done years ago. He had a child, a son, with a woman he met before he took over Harper Enterprises. But he abandoned them, Liz. He let the family pressure him into walking away, and it broke him. That's why he's been so cruel to you. He's projecting his own guilt." The revelation hit me like a freight train, and I gripped the counter to steady myself. James, my cold, calculating brother, had a son, a child he'd turned his back on because of our family's expectations. It explained so much: the bitterness, the need to control, the way he'd lashed out at me. He'd been carrying this secret for years, letting it fester into something dark and ugly, and I'd been the easiest target for his pain. "You think hurting me would erase your pain?" I said later that night, when James finally showed up at the house. His face haggard, his eyes bloodshot. We stood in the living room, the fire casting long shadows across the walls, and I felt Damien's presence behind me, a silent support. James's gaze dropped, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. "You don't understand, Elizabeth," he said, his voice raw. I had no choice, but I did understand, more than he realized. I'd spent my life trying to prove myself to a family that never saw me, just as he'd tried to prove himself by abandoning his own child. The difference was, I wasn't willing to let that pain define me anymore. "We can fix this," I said, my voice steady despite the tears in my eyes. "But you have to be honest. With me, with Mom, with yourself." James looked at me, his expression a mix of shame and hope, and for the first time in years I saw my brother. Not the monster he'd become, but the man he could be. And as I stood there, with Damien by my side and my mother watching from the couch, I knew that healing our family would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. But it was the only way forward. The boardroom of Harper Enterprises gleamed with the kind of opulence that only old money could buy. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the polished walnut table and casting golden streaks across the walls, adorned with framed awards and family portraits. The scent of leather and expensive cologne lingered in the air, a reminder of the power that had once defined this space. I stood near the head of the table, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, the silver ring Damien had given me now on a chain around my neck, resting against my heart. It was a talisman, a reminder of the strength I'd found in the chaos of the past few days. Damien stood beside me, his presence a steady anchor in the storm I knew was coming. His black suit was impeccably tailored, his amber eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity that made even the most seasoned board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. He'd called this meeting, using his new authority as the owner of Harper Enterprises to summon James and the rest of the board. I'd agreed to be here, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I needed to face my brother one last time, to see if there was any chance for redemption, for healing, for the family we'd once been. The door opened, and James walked in, his face haggard, his usually pristine suit slightly wrinkled. The past few days had taken their toll. The media frenzy, the loss of the company, the weight of his own secrets exposed. He looked at me, his eyes shadowed with a mix of shame and defiance. And for a moment, I saw the brother I'd once loved, the one who'd taught me how to ride a bike and sneaked me cookies when our parents weren't looking. But that boy was buried beneath years of bitterness, and I wasn't sure if I could reach him anymore. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice hoarse as he stopped a few feet away. "I didn't think you'd come." There was a vulnerability in his tone, a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long, and it gave me a flicker of hope. I glanced at Damien, drawing strength from the quiet nod he gave me, and then turned back to James. I had to, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. We need to end this, James, for all of us. He sat down across from me, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them on the table. The board members watched in silence, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. But I ignored them. This wasn't about them. It was about my family, about the wounds we'd inflicted on each other, about the chance to heal. I know what you did, I said, my voice softening but firm. About your son, James. About how you walked away because of the family's expectations. I know it broke you. James's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock, and I saw the color drain from his face. How did you? He stammered, but I cut him off with a raised hand. Sophie found out, I said. And she told me because she knew. It was the only way to understand why you've been so cruel. You've been punishing me for your own guilt, James. But it doesn't have to be this way. You can make things right. For a moment, he didn't speak, his gaze dropping to the table, as if he could find answers in the grain of the wood. Then, slowly, he looked up at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I found him, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My son, Ethan. I tracked him down a few months ago, after years of pretending he didn't exist. I've been trying to make things right with him and his mother, but I didn't know how to tell you, or Mom. I was ashamed. The confession hit me like a wave, and I felt a rush of emotions, relief, sadness, and a quiet pride in the brother I thought I'd lost. He'd taken the first step toward redemption, and that meant there was hope. You should have told us, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Mom deserves to know her grandson, James. And I deserve to know my nephew. James nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek, and I saw the weight of years of guilt lift slightly from his shoulders. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, he said, his voice breaking. For everything. For the wedding, for the way I've treated you, for letting my pain turn me into someone I don't even recognize. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to. Try to be better. For Ethan, for Mom, for you. I swallowed hard, the tears I'd been holding back threatening to spill over. I thought of my mother's words, the lessons she'd taught me about forgiveness and resilience, about the strength it took to rebuild what had been broken. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, I said, my voice steady now. But I want our family to heal. We can do this together, James. But you have to keep being honest. With all of us. He nodded again, and for the first time in years, I saw a glimmer of the brother I'd once known. The board members shifted in their seats, their presence a reminder of the larger battle still ahead, but I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. Damien reached for my hand under the table, his touch warm and reassuring, and I squeezed it back, grateful for the man who'd stood by me through this storm. Later that evening, I stood in the kitchen of our Hamptons estate, the scent of garlic and rosemary filling the air as I chopped vegetables for dinner. My mother sat at the counter, a glass of wine in her hand, her smile soft as she watched me. It's been a long time since we did this, she said, her voice warm with nostalgia. I nodded, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board grounding me in the moment. Too long, I agreed, glancing at her with a smile of my own. James had left to meet with Ethan and his mother, a promise to bring them to meet us soon, and I felt a quiet hope blooming in my chest. I turned to Damien, who was setting the table nearby, his sleeves rolled up, a rare vulnerability in his movements. He caught my gaze, and the warmth in his amber eyes made my heart skip a beat. We'll get through this, he said, his voice a quiet promise. I nodded, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly, and as I looked around at my mother, at Damien, at the promise of a family reunited, I knew we were on the path to something new, something better. The chapel in the Hamptons glowed once more, its stained glass windows catching the soft light of the setting sun, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the pews. The air was filled with the scent of roses and lavender, a delicate sweetness that felt like a promise this time, not a lie. I stood at the altar, my hands steady as I adjusted the bodice of my new wedding gown, a simpler design than the one I'd worn a year ago, but infinitely more meaningful. The ivory lace hugged my frame, its softness a reflection of the peace I'd finally found. And as I looked out at the small gathering of guests, I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't known was possible. This was no farce, no cruel jest, orchestrated by my brother James to break me. This was real, a ceremony born of love, of healing, of a journey I'd never expected to take. The chapel was filled with the people who mattered most. My mother, Margaret, sitting in the front row, her smile radiant despite the lines of age on her face. Sophie, my best friend, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her laughter a bright note in the quiet. And James, my brother, who stood beside my mother, his expression a mix of pride and humility. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined him here. Not after everything he'd done, but time and forgiveness had changed us all. I turned to Damien Blackwood, the man who'd become my anchor, my partner, my love. He stood beside me, his black suit as impeccable as ever, but there was a softness in his amber eyes that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability he'd let me see, piece by piece over the past year. We'd been through so much together, the scandal that had rocked my family, the media storm that followed Damien's revelation, the painful process of rebuilding what had been broken. But through it all, Damien had been there, steady and unwavering, his belief in me a lifeline when I'd doubted myself. The priest began the ceremony, his voice warm and gentle, but I barely heard the words. My focus was on Damien, on the way his hand held mine, his thumb brushing softly over my knuckles, a silent promise that we were in this together. I thought back to that first night in this same chapel, when I'd stood here in a gown I hated, my heart cold with anger and fear. I'd been a different woman then, closed off, afraid to feel, afraid to hope. James's cruel jest had meant to break me, to force me into a marriage with a man he thought was a homeless drifter. But instead, it had led me to Damien, a hidden billionaire who'd seen me for who I truly was. You saved me, Elizabeth, Damien said, his voice low and steady as he spoke his vows. The words meant for me alone despite the small crowd. His eyes held mine, and I saw the depth of his love, the strength of the man who'd fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. You showed me what it means to love, to be loved, to build a life worth living. My throat tightened, tears welling in my eyes, and I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with a joy I'd never thought I'd know. No, I said, my voice soft but clear as I spoke my own vows, the tears slipping down my cheeks now. We saved each other. And we had. Damien had given me the courage to face my family's past, to confront James and help him find his way back to the man he could be. And I'd given Damien a reason to open his heart again, to let go of the walls he'd built after his mother's death, to believe in a future that wasn't defined by power or wealth. Together, we'd found something greater, a love that had grown from the ashes of pain, a love that had made us whole. The priest pronounced us husband and wife, and Damien pulled me into his arms, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both tender and fierce. A promise sealed in the glow of the chapel. Lights. The guests clapped, their applause a warm wave that washed over us, and I laughed against Damien's mouth, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure happiness. Sophie's cheer was the loudest, her voice cutting through the crowd, and I caught her eye sharing a smile that spoke of years of friendship and unwavering support. As we pulled apart, I turned to my family, my heart full. James stepped forward, his son Ethan at his side, a bright-eyed boy of 10 who'd become a part of our lives over the past year. James had worked hard to rebuild his relationship with Ethan and his mother, and seeing them together now, I felt a quiet pride in my brother. "I'm so happy for you, Liz," he said, his voice thick with emotion, and I hugged him tightly, feeling the last of the walls between us crumble. My mother joined us, her arms wrapping around me in a familiar embrace. Her lavender scent a comfort that brought tears to my eyes. "You've made me so proud," she whispered, her voice trembling. And I held her close, grateful for the woman who'd taught me what it meant to be strong, to forgive, to love. The reception was a small affair, held in the chapel's garden, under a canopy of fairy lights, the ocean a soft murmur in the background. I stood with Damien, my hand in his, watching as our family and friends laughed and danced. I adjusted the lace of my gown one last time, the fabric soft against my skin, and smiled at my mother and James, who were sharing a quiet moment with Ethan. Sophie caught my eye again, her tears now replaced with a mischievous grin, and I knew she was already planning our next adventure. I looked up at Damien, his amber eyes glowing in the twilight, and I felt a profound sense of peace. A year ago, I'd stood in this chapel as a prisoner, my heart cold and my future uncertain. But now, I was free. Free to love, free to heal, free to build a life with the man who'd seen me at my worst and loved me anyway. We had faced the darkness together, and in doing so, we'd found a happiness I'd never thought possible. A late-blooming happiness that was all the sweeter for the journey it had taken to get here. Beneath the chapel lights, I knew that this was only the beginning, and that's the end of this heartfelt journey, a story of redemption, love, and the power of family. If this tale touched your heart as much as it did mine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and uplift. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share the next adventure with you. See you in the next video.